Apologies have been received from Deputies Darragh O'Brien and Deputies Fergus O'Dowd. Deputy Shane Castles will be substituting for Deputy O'Brien. This meeting has now been convened for the purpose of consideration by this committee of the Local Government Rates Bill 2018, which will be preceded by a briefing from officials from the Department of Planning, Housing and Local Government. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode. This will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Items number 1 on the agenda is briefing on Local Government Rates Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to today's meeting from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government Mr Barry Quinlan, Ms Lorraine O'Donoghue, Ms Sinead O'Gorman, Ms Sheila McMahon and Mr Paul Hogan and Ms Patricia Curran. Before we begin, just a quick note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. If you are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Mr Barry Quinlan to make his opening statement.
Thanks very much. Chair, members, I'm pleased to be here this morning to assist the committee in its consideration of the Local Government Rates Bill 2018, particularly to discuss proposed report stage amendments. This is a very important piece of legislation and I want to thank the committee members for their time and consideration. I'm joined by a number of colleagues, Lorraine O'Donoghue and Sinead O'Gorman, who have been working very hard on the rates bill from a local government finance section in the department. Sheila McMahon, who's here to cover the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act amendments, Patricia Curran and Paul Hogan, who are here to cover the planning amendments. As requested, we've provided some advance briefing to the committee that are covering these report stage amendments. Commercial rates are a critical source of funding for local authorities, accounting for 1.51 billion or 32% of the 4.67 billion expenditure budgeted in the sector in 2018. The overall aim of this rates bill is to modernise and improve the rates regime. In this regard, the drafting process is complex and of necessity requires significant ongoing consultation with key stakeholders, particularly local authorities, the Valuation Office. I might just mention that in terms of important provisions not subject to amendment, the bill provides for the introduction of rates alleviation waiver schemes by local authorities subject to ministerial approval, which can support important policy objectives contained in local, economic, community and land use plans. The bill also contains important provisions around collection and enforcement for local authorities. The bill went through second stage in the Dáil on 30 January 2019, at which time a number of amendments were signalled for introduction at committee stage. Report stage is now provisionally scheduled for the 3rd of July. Committee stage consideration will take place immediately after this briefing session, and Minister Phelan will be in attendance, and it will present an opportunity to discuss important amendments such as those relating to the Valuation Acts. These changes are required to ensure that the National Revaluation Programme, which is ongoing, remains net revenue neutral for local authorities, taking account of the revaluation of utilities on a global basis and the impact of successful appeals to the Valuation Tribunal. In this context, an amendment to the Commissioner to allow the Commissioner of Evaluation share the preliminary valuation of Irish water with local authorities is time critical. That valuation is underway at the moment. To facilitate calculations for 2020 budgets in local authorities. In terms of report stage amendments, there are a small number of important but mainly technical amendments which were not ready for tabling at committee stage, but which it is intended to introduce at report stage. There will be a number of further amendments relevant to the rates bill. Furthermore, amendments to the Planning and Development Acts and the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 and Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2019 are proposed. In terms of the rates bill, amendments to the rates regime are proposed to enhance the notification procedures and provision for additions and amendments to the valuation list to be immediately effective for rating purposes. So there's a delay at the moment. There may be a further amendment that is still subject to drafting. In terms of the Residential Tenancies Acts, an amendment to the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2019 is required to overcome a risk that might allow the definition of owner of student accommodation to be construed in a manner that could circumvent the intention of the Act. This amendment is required prior to imminent planned commencement of the student accommodation provisions. Technical amendments relating to the timing of commencement of the student accommodation provisions are also required. An amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act 2004 is required to provide an alternative route for protected structures to qualify, further to substantial refurbishment works, for exemption from rent increase restrictions in RPZs, rent pressure zones, because they will be unlikely to qualify under the provisions as recently enacted in the 2019 Act. The objective is to eliminate any potential negative impact on planned refurbishment of protected structures in the rental sector. In terms of the Planning Acts, an amendment is required to the Planning and Development Act 2000 to address transitional issues following the establishment of the Office of the Planning Regulator. This is a time-critical amendment in the context of the ongoing development of regional, spatial and economic strategies by regional assemblies. A further minor technical amendment is also being proposed to underpin the special provisions for Cork City and County Councils to extend the period for review of their development plans in order to incorporate regional, spatial and economic strategies, the Southern Strategy, into their plans. A possible amendment to the Local Government Act 1998 to reinsert a provision inadvertently deleted which empowers the Exchequer to pay into the Local Government Fund is deemed not now required following further legal advice on the matter. Thank you very much, and we look forward to our discussion, and we've given some more detail in the briefing note on those proposed amendments.
Thanks, Barry.
Chair.
Any questions for Barry? Owen?
Thanks, and Barry and folks, thanks very much for taking the time to come in. Look, the first thing to say, and this is not a criticism of any of you that are in the room at the moment, but there is a certain amount of dissatisfaction in the committee, and it's important to put it on the record that yet again, I suppose, we're being notified of report stage amendments that we won't get to scrutinise during committee. Now, I appreciate the idea of you coming in today is to at least fill part of that gap, and we're very grateful for you. But I suppose so that the Minister hears loud and clear the view of the committee that it would have been much better if the amendments were brought through the full proper process of committee and report stage. But we've always been a very flexible committee, and we don't want to stand in the way of some of the important amendments. I have two concerns with two of the proposed report state amendments, and I'd like to hear more. Obviously, the student accommodation and the rates ones are broadly very sensible as far as I can see, but the protected structures and the RPZs, if I understand the problem correctly, it's that the BER requirements in the new definition of substantial refurbishment causes a difficulty for the pre-63 properties because, of course, they're exempt from BER upgrades. What I don't understand is would it not have made more sense just to remove that provision of the new definition of substantial refurbishment from the eligibility criteria for pre-63 properties to become eligible for substantial refurbishment? Was that considered? Have I misunderstood it? And why is it that the solution to the problem is a 12-month rather than a 24-month period outside of the rental market? If you can maybe explain that to me. I also have a concern about the regional, spatial and economic strategies, because once again we're giving a very significant power to the Minister, and the whole idea of the planning regulator, and I don't want to go back over that whole debate, but you know, as Mahan rightly pointed out, there was an over-concentration of power in the hands of the Minister and the Department, and the idea of the regulator was to shift that. And yet here it talks about where, in the case of the current regional, spatial and economic strategy processes, the amendment will allow the Minister to issue a ministerial direction to the regional assemblies, quote, to take such specified measures as he or she may require in relation to that plan. So again, that does seem to me another significant shift in power to the Minister and an undermining of the regional and local authorities. And I suppose I'd like your response to that. I'm open to supporting both amendments at report stage, but I'm just struggling with those two questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Owen. Any more questions?
Yes,
Pat.
Do we want to get in, just in relation to global revaluations, just specifically currently in relation to Irish Water? While I'm aware that the Valuation Office is currently carrying out the valuation of Irish Water, there is some indications coming through of how that will be broken down across each local authority, and I have heard the word population might be used in relation to how that is calculated. And just in relation to my own county, because I would know it well, this is going, if that is the way it is calculated, and I'm also getting indications that by coincidence the valuation might end up being the same as the total valuation of Irish Water at the moment, which will be interesting if it does end up being the same. But if it's divided by population, then the likes of Wicklow will lose out significantly. Now, Wicklow, in fairness, had rated all its water infrastructure in its books. I'm equally of the understanding that a number of counties didn't rate any of their water infrastructure. So, first of all, is there a question around the current valuation of Irish Water, how it was, the fact that some counties had no valuation on it? Secondly, when the Valuation Office comes with their valuation of the utility Irish Water, whose decision is it how to apportion that, and how is that going to be apportioned? And if it is going to be apportioned through population, what happens to the likes of Wicklow, which will probably lose out in the tune of 1.6 million in commercial rates? And just to get an understanding of exactly the processes that takes place, what involvement have we in it, what involvement has the government in it, or who decides how it's done at the end of the day once the valuation put their value on each, just on that aspect of it?
Thanks, Pat. Shay, have you any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and glad to be here this morning to participate in something that is hugely important for so many businesses across the country. And as Pat has said and as Deputy O'Brien has said, in terms of the impact, when you consider that, I think 1.5 billion raised in commercial rates, and it is the most significant contributor to the running of local councils throughout the country. But I would echo what Deputy O'Brien has said in respect of just, and I appreciate everything is time sensitive, but again, the add-ons here, and similar to the Cork City Bill, when we dealt with that, and there was add-ons then at report stage in terms of the proposals for municipal councils across boundary situations, and that failed because it was such a late add-on and there wasn't proper debate. So I would ask, in terms of, Barry, and thanks for the briefing, in respect of the issues that you raised there, in respect of the Planning Act and the regional spatial and economic strategies, just to flesh that out, Cathaoirleach, maybe you've discussed them more in depth, but I would appreciate, because we are heading in a situation towards this country where regional assemblies are going to have far more clout than councils, and that has huge impact in terms of the hierarchy of plans, from the National Development Plan to these regional strategies and effectively the council. So I would ask, we're discussing a rates bill, the actual impact of this, and to flesh that out as well here this morning.
Thanks, Shane. Barry?
Okay, thanks very much. In terms of the protected structures, we're going to take that first. Sheila McMahon is here. Sorry, Sheila. So maybe on that one, Sheila.
Yeah, the issue is that the description of substantial works that was inserted into the Section 19 in the 2019 Amendment Act, the ones relating to the improvement in the BER ratings weren't actually capable of being applicable to protected structures. They are to pre-63 structures, but it's just the protected structures within that. And it's to do with the technical issue to do with the whole system of BER ratings in this country emanates from an EU directive, and the regulations are made under the 72 Act. So it means that they can only be applied as a requirement as opposed to an optional sort of facility, and they can't be used like that. So it turned out then, in relation to the protected structures, that the only way in which they could qualify for the exemption would be either that there was a greater than 25% increase, or greater than more than 25% of the property was refurbished, or that they met all three of the ones relating to access for adaptation for disabled people, increase in the layout and increase in the number of rooms, which would have meant effectively it would have been very difficult for them to qualify under the actual grounds of the change in the substantial refurbishment works. So in order to provide an alternative way in which those particular subset of buildings in the rental sector could qualify, so that there wouldn't be a deterrent effect on actually doing needed refurbishment work. This amendment is being introduced whereby if it is the case that there hasn't been a tenancy in the building for 12 months prior to the new tenancy that commences after the works, then there would be the exemption from the application of the 4% rent increase restriction in the RPZs. So it's an alternative. It'll still be 2 years for every other building.
Can I ask a supplementary on that? So just so I'm clear, first of all, so this amendment only deals with protected structures rather than the generality of the pre-63 structures?
Protected or proposed protected.
And the second question then is, so does that mean the requirements under the recent change in legislation won't apply at all? It'll simply be the 12-month rule?
They will apply, but what is not capable of being satisfied by a protected structure is the one relating to the 7-point improvement in BER ratings. Even if they do improve by 7 points, legally they won't be deemed to have. And the 4 and 5, which were the either 2 or 3 point improvement, along with 2 other, either the increase in the permanent change to the internal layout, the increase in the number of rooms, or the disability access. The two relating to BER improvements of either 2 or 3 point ratings in association with 2 out of those other 3 is not capable of being.
So, and again, it's just for clarity. So, if the property hasn't been let for the previous 12 months, what other requirements from the
that on its own can qualify.
That's on its own.
Just as for a non-protected structure, if it hadn't been let for the previous 2 years.
No, I get that. Yeah, so none of
the
the other stipulations of substantial refurbishment would apply to such a property. The only criteria would be if it hadn't been let for the previous 12 months, it would then be exempt from. Yeah. And is that because it's not just that the BER aren't a legal requirement, but there are issues around the disability and the floor space change because of the protected nature of the structures? Is that the rationale for it?
Yeah, we understand that it is very difficult and virtually impossible for a protected structure to be able to carry out the type of works that would qualify under the other routes, because of the strong controls over the sort of changes you can make to those buildings. But the objective would be still, though, that those buildings that are not in good condition should be, that they would be improved to be made more comfortable for tenants.
But there is no, for those properties, there is no statutory definition of what substantial refurbishment is. Exactly.
Yeah, just for the protected structures. Sorry, it wouldn't be correct to say it like that. For all of them, for any dwelling, the exemption is available if there has been a 2-year. No tenancy in the preceding 2 years to the one that is commenced, just in relation to the initial rent setting. After that, then the restrictions will apply, and the same, but it's just in the case of protected structures that's now 1 year as opposed to the 2 years, and again only for the initial rent setting, or sorry, it will be if this amendment is passed, and then it would be the 4% restriction would apply to subsequent rent reviews.
Thanks.
Okay, so I might ask Paul Hogan to address the questions in relation to planning and the RSCSs. So there was Deputy O'Brien and Deputy Castles both had questions on that.
Okay, so I suppose this is to address a kind of an interim situation that arises. And basically up until the 3rd of April this year, what's envisaged is a power that the Minister has always had. And up until now, the Department on behalf of the Minister has been fully engaged in all 3 regional spatial strategy processes. So all three are well advanced, and in fact the one for the Eastern Midlands region is due to be published on Friday this week. So it's that well advanced, it's almost complete. And the problem we have here is that the legislation has made the involvement of the Minister in the process subject to the involvement of the OPR from the outset. So what's currently enacted, so the problem basically is that the legislation that we now have has made the involvement of the Minister in the process at this stage subject to the involvement of the regulator from the outset in the process, which can never be achieved because we can't turn the clock back. So we're in kind of it arises because this legislation was drafted or published in 2016, enacted last year, and it was always envisaged that the OPR the regulator would be in place before the RSES, the regional strategies, kicked off. But they didn't, the office wasn't, and it didn't happen like that. So they've travelled down the road. The regulators come in, pretty much 3/4, 2/3 of the way through all of the processes. And as I said, the legislation envisages the regulator being given notice, making submissions, being very clear about what the issues are, what he wants to see, or his office wants to see, or his or her office wants to see, from all the way through, and then on foot of that either happening or not happening, making a recommendation to the Minister at the very end for the Minister to act. But the reality is the Department on behalf of the Minister has been involved to date, and in line with legislation that was there till the 3rd of April. So what this amendment seeks to simply do is put a kind of a once-off interim arrangement in place for the current round of RSESs, all of which are at a slightly different stage, and simply enable the process as it was prior to the 3rd of April to be concluded, as it would have been. However, there is one addition that's new, that enables the Minister to invite the regulator to make to issue a report to the Minister, to advise the Minister, an advisory report to the Minister, basically. And that's seen as, something that would enable at least the advice of the regulator's office to be brought in to the current process. It's a new provision. But it gets us over the problem of the regulator not having been involved all the way through and having things on the record that they said, because, there is a sort of an issue about legal consistency where you can't have someone coming in at the 11th hour raising new issues or whatever. So the ability to involve the regulator is the only new element. Otherwise, it's just putting the clock back to prior to the 3rd of April. And the regulator's office, even at this stage, is only recruiting staff now. So the reality is there won't be a significant capacity there to make to undertake what was envisaged, even if we could set the clock back.
So why do it in the first place? Why are you putting this on this footing? If you say the office of the regulator isn't going to even be have the capacity to actually, if you're publishing the Eastern Midland report on Friday,
well, it's been through a process. It's concluded. And
I know that, yeah.
Yeah. So there are 3 regional strategies, and all 3 now face, as it stands, a legal kind of what I call sort of there's a legal gap basically where there is no provision for anyone to oversee the conclusion of the process as envisaged in the legislation. And the only remedy is judicial review, which would be a far more difficult and complex remedy for anybody, any party.
But sure, but in relation to this, so the reason you want to obviously do this is in anticipation of or in case of something being one of those spatial plans that the Minister or the Department feels isn't consistent with the National Planning Framework or the government strategies.
Yes. Yeah.
So I suppose if you don't do this, what you're saying is if one of the spatial strategies isn't consistent in the view of the Minister or the Department, the only recourse the Minister would then have would be a judicial review.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
And do you anticipate any such
Yeah,
gaps between what you expect to be in the plans and the NPF and existing government strategies?
It's quite possible, yes. I mean, the way it works is once the strategy is published, the Minister then has a period of time in which to form a view as to whether or not the strategy complies with national planning policy and guidelines, etc. So I suppose I don't want to prejudge the ability of the Minister to make that decision, but there are issues in respect of some, some elements of the adopted, the soon-to-be adopted plan in the East and Midlands. There's also issues ongoing, I suppose, in the North and West and the South that, may not be resolved by the end of the process, but we can't anticipate how that will go.
Okay.
I'm slightly confused at this stage. So the purpose of this is to allow the planning regulator to make a report.
No, it's simply a timing issue. Just to ensure that someone has the responsibility to oversee this process, because as it stands, the way the legislation is, the regulator can't get involved in the process, and the Minister's involvement has effectively been curtailed since the 3rd of April. So no one is responsible at this point in time, and that was simply a kind of that's for the lack of a transitional arrangement, basically. So this is a transitional arrangement, given that we're now well advanced on the 3, and that wasn't envisaged when the legislation was drafted.
But it is more than a timing issue in the sense that, because it's quite a significant provision, and clearly it's a provision that was intended in the original legislation that was published back in 2016. But so we're very clear, if the Minister or the Department is concerned that the content of one of these plans is a problem, this gives the Minister an avenue to resolve that problem in line with the National Planning Framework and government strategies.
Yes.
Yeah. So the Minister would then request planning regulator to go in, do a report, make recommendations to the Minister as per the legislation, and then the Minister at that point would then be legally entitled to act to say to the regional authorities to amend their draft plan in line with government policy. Am I wrong on that?
It's not subject to the regulator. It's an advisory role, because the regulator has no history with the processes today.
Sure. My point is, because the Minister is only able to I'll use the word intervene, you might have a more polite word, but intervene in this process through the Office of the Planning Regulator. This is the mechanism through which it allows the Minister and the Department to intervene if the Minister or Department feels there's a problem with one of those spatial strategies.
Yeah, I mean, legally and legislatively, it's easier just to revert to the situation as it was for a whole variety of reasons, and that was the advice we got. But we were keen also to ensure that there was some role for the regulator, given that was what the legislation envisaged.
And on that point from Deputy O'Brien through the Chair, does the Minister, because this is the key point, does he invite the regulator to conduct that report? But that's on the basis of the Minister and the Department not being happy with what's possibly published, no?
No. I think it would be prudent to seek the advice, irrespective, because the Minister has to form a view, and there could be things that may or may not be noticed or picked up. These are very complex documents.
Okay, and the kind of the statutory basis then, or the weight of the report conducted by the new Office of the Planning Regulator carries what weight in terms of, is it simply just an advisory document, or?
Yeah, it is advisory in the transitional arrangement, but that's ultimately, and the legislation, as enacted for all future regional strategies will remain, and in the future scenario it'll be a much more binding it's a much more binding set of advice, because it's based on a kind of involvement from the very beginning of the process that's followed through, and if not taken, needs to be reported on to the Oireachtas.
Although under the planning regulating legislation, it's not binding, it's just if the Minister chooses not to accept that advice, the Minister, he or she, has to then lay on the record of the Dáil the reasons why. So in no sense is it binding. Just the Minister has to explain why they're not accepting it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Any further questions?
The adoption of the full adoption of the regional strategies has to happen by when?
Yeah, so at a meeting on the 3rd of May, the East and Midland Regional Assembly agreed to make their strategy on the 28th of June. So it comes into effect on the 28th of June. And the Minister has a period of, I think we've changed it to 6 weeks. So there's a period of 6 weeks in which the Minister is to form a view. It was previously, prior to the 3rd of April, 4 weeks. The 6 weeks is to allow for the input of the regulator should it be sought.
So within 6 weeks of this Friday,
yes,
it has to be adopted.
No.
Or the Minister has, sorry, apologies. The Minister has the opportunity
may issue a direction if he so requires.
Okay. And at the end of that 6 weeks, if he says he's reverting to the office for a view on that, does that extend it even further?
No.
No, he has to get the view within the 6 week period.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. So it was 4 weeks when there was no regulator. The period of 6 weeks is to allow for that additional reporting.
Okay.
Pat?
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I don't know whether I am or not. It's just, if everything was in sync and there wasn't the timing issue, and can we pick the Mid-Eastern Regional Strategy as it's the one that has been adopted? And if everything was correct, what would have happened at this stage?
Yeah.
It would have went to the planning regulator. Is that correct? Planning regulator then would have made a report to the minister. No, so, okay, just take me back the sequence that would have happened if the timing was right in relation to the legislation.
Yeah,
and
so
what's the difference?
Instead of the department making the submissions from the outset, it would have been the regulator's office that would have been making the submissions and been back and forth with the regulator, and they would have been keeping the department informed, but if you like, the primary point of contact and assessment is the regulator's office. So at this, let's say we'd got to this stage and the regulator had been involved from the beginning. From Friday, the regulator then would be in a position where he would then report to the minister based on whether or not his recommendations have been taken on board and whether or not he considers the strategy has complied with national and other guidance, and would likewise report to the minister in the 6 week period, or the 4 week period, and the minister then has 6 weeks to act from the beginning of the process, so another 2 weeks on top of the 4 weeks.
Okay, so basically all we're realistically doing is adding an extra 2 weeks
to
allow the regulator just to overview the regional strategy that it conforms to all national strategies.
Yes.
Realistically, that's all this piece of legislation is.
That's the net effect of it if we just start now. But I suppose the legal reality is that the regulator hasn't been involved all the way to date. Yeah.
Okay, and if the regulator has an issue with the plan, what happens then?
Yeah. So the minister may form a view, and if the minister agrees with the regulator, the minister is then empowered to issue a draft direction to the local authority in the first instance, to the regional assembly. So the regional assembly then has a period of time to consider the draft direction and make a response. And then there's a further process where the regulator, the minister. It's as before. The minister basically considers the report of the director of the regional assembly, and then decides on foot of that whether to either make the direction or whether to invite an independent report to be done. Then there's a period of time for an independent report, if need be, and then finally on foot of that, the minister makes a final decision.
Okay, so it's basically the minister is now acting on the planning regulator's advice to give direction to the regional assembly. It's similar to a county development plan. Basically.
Exactly the same, yeah.
Where there's a ministerial direction going down and it goes through the process.
Yeah.
So it's actually the very same.
Yes, the same process. Yeah.
Okay.
Any further clarifications, Owen?
It's a question. Just in terms of student accommodation, this is one I obviously support. Is the issue that the definition of owner in the bill that we passed may allow, for example, the likes of a shell company to get some kind of permission and then restructure themselves so that the terms of the original Act wouldn't apply, or just give us a little bit more information about the kind of loophole. I think I understand it, but I just want to understand it properly.
With use of sort of lessors to actually issue the licences, to give out the licences to occupy to the students as opposed to the owners. Oh, sorry. It was the definition was actually intended. It was kind of overlooked in that it needed, when it went into the draft provision, the drafter explained to me that he had intended to. It was sort of a temporary definition that he was using, and he had intended to go back and consider further whether or not it was, ensured that there were no ways of circumventing it, but that, other work intervened and he didn't get around to it.
And in as simple a way as possible, explain how that loophole could work.
The owner of the accommodations, they could set up a separate company and give it a lease, and depending on the duration of the lease, if the lease term was for less than 5 years, certainly, then that would mean that it would not fall within the definition in the legislation, so therefore the provisions wouldn't apply.
And my question is, could the same loophole apply in other relevant legislation, for example, to co-living or to other kind of recent innovations in terms of leased properties? Has anybody checked if the loophole that's been identified, or potential loophole that's been identified in the drafting here, also exists, for example, in elsewhere?
Well, this provision is in isolation because it is dealing with licensed accommodation, student accommodation, and the residential tenancies legislation specifically does not ever apply to licensed accommodation. So this would be the only type of licensed accommodation that would be encompassed by it. And it's very specific to the student-specific accommodation.
So you're pretty certain that type of loophole couldn't apply, for example, in a co-living development as opposed to a student-specific accommodation?
Co-living developments, to the best of my knowledge, they wouldn't come within the legislation anyway because there isn't exclusive occupation. So the Residential Tenancies Acts actually only apply to tenancies, and this is the first exception to that by the application to the student-specific accommodation occupied under licence as well as occupied under tenancy.
Although the Residential Tenancies Board are on record at this committee to say that there would be certain circumstances, even before this legislation was introduced, where certain kinds of licences would have entitled a licensee to claim exclusive occupation and therefore would have fallen under some of the provisions of the Residential Tenancies Act. But that has been their view for quite some time.
Sorry, if it is in fact a tenancy, although claimed, say, by one of the parties that it's a licence, they would look beyond what it actually is,
Sure.
and then if it was a tenancy, yes, the legislation would apply. So sometimes that claim would be made that something is a licence when in fact it is a tenancy. But if it is a genuine licence, then the legislation doesn't apply.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might just address then, I think it was, if that covers everything on the planning and the RTA, in relation to rates and Irish Water valuation. So that valuation, the first valuation of Irish Water is underway. There's another couple of global valuations, ESB and AirGrid, for this year as well. But in terms of the Irish Water one, we've had, obviously the Commissioner for Valuation is independent. That process is happening, but we have engaged with the Commissioner and with local authorities, so that to the greatest extent possible there's an understanding, but the figures are not available yet. The preliminary will be the 18th of July. At the moment, the Minister will be notified of that. Local authorities normally wouldn't, but that's one of the amendments. And these are committee stage amendments, so there'll be an opportunity to discuss these with the Minister. And then the other two amendments are very important, particularly for local authorities that are being revalued at the same time as a global. And in terms then of there's an appeals bit as well. But just on and then I suppose you've got that process, and there's a number that comes out of that for a local authority, and then in relation to what that means for local authority finances, I suppose that's kind of a separate process that we're engaged with the local authorities in terms of funding and possibly the estimates process later this year, etc. So both of those pieces are happening on track, but in a way it's operating in a bit of an information vacuum until you have that final figure. In terms of the apportionment under the Act, that's done by the Commissioner, and the previous ones, I understand, it have been done by population. So I don't know whether any of the colleagues want to add anything.
Yeah, just to add on, because I was around the last time it happened, just for clarification, that apportionment is set out in section 53 of the Valuation Act, and it's done by order. It's, as Barry said, it's in consultation with the Commissioner, but the Minister is empowered under the legislation to make the order. all global utilities to date have been apportioned on a population basis. And as Barry has said, there's 2 other global utilities being revalued for next year. I think it's ESB and EirGrid. So previously they would have been apportioned under that order on the basis of population data in the census, and it's done in that way to date because that's, you know, independently verifiable. It treats every local authority the same, and it's very transparent and it's robust data. So that's the reason that approach has been taken. Now, obviously, it's a decision of the minister to make later on this year, but I would expect that the same apportion mechanism will apply for the 3 utilities this year.
Okay, just to maybe expand a little bit on that, because currently the 46 million that's generated by Irish Water, 2 counties get 0 compensation. So there's going to be counties who are going to lose out significantly on this apportionment if it's done on a population basis, because currently the valuations have been valued in by the asset in each county. And what will happen if there is a gap between the revenues in the counties? While I have it here before the Minister comes in, I want to equally try and get my head around half the alphabet numbers that are in Amendment number 15. And I assume that's in relation to global valuations and national valuations that happen in the 1 year. And for the life of me, I still cannot work it out. You've used 11 letters of the alphabet to come up with a formula that is mind-boggling, to say the least. And I suppose the idea of it is to protect counties who have a global revaluation and a national revaluation happening in the 1 year. Because if you don't do something, they would lose out on the global revaluation. But I don't know why we need a formula with 11 characters in it to try and calculate. I thought the simple way would be to take that complete valuation out of the equation and its revenue, and then do what you're left with, and then add it all back together at the end of the day, so the county would get the benefit. I haven't tried to work out A to J or A to K because I lost the will to live. So I don't want to land the minister when he comes in. So I have concerns anyway in relation to Irish Water, but equally I have concerns into what's exactly happening here. Because quite honestly with you, I lost the will. Okay. I think I got as far as F and I said, I've had enough. And I just couldn't work it out. Is there any way you could give us exactly how that's worked out in identifying A to K and what the steps you're taking?
Yeah.
Debbie, I might just say at the start, I think there's kind of 2 pieces. The legislation will address the revaluation piece. There is the whole thing then about the impact of the revaluation of, or the valuation of Irish Water and how the apportionment, etc., and the impact that has on local authorities. So I think only when we know that, there'll be, that will have implications, whether it's the redistribution of it and how that operates, or just the impact of the valuation itself in terms of the funding that was available previously. The second bit, I did signal that it's a very complex piece of legislation. And
before maybe Lorraine goes into that, on that, will you come back? Will the committee have an involvement in that Irish Water process, or will it be down to the Commission and the Minister to decide the apportionment at the end of the day in relation to Irish Water, or will we get any sight of it at all? Just in relation to Irish Water now, not the other bit.
I think the process as laid out in the Act is, and how it works now, is that the Commissioner makes recommendations and then the Minister makes an order. But I mean, say from our perspective, I'm acutely aware of the potential impact on local authorities. A number of them have written to us directly, but again, it's based on estimates of what they know. So that piece of it, of actually working out the impact local authority by local authority, we're going to be doing that. And then there's a piece of work to see in terms of what the valuation will be and what the impact on a local authority by local authority basis. And our understanding is that it will have a significant impact on some local authorities. There'll be other local authorities that will benefit from it, but I think it's only when you have that table that you can see then, look, there's going to be a process. I've said that to the local authorities, that we will have to engage on that. And it's something that, look, we are working with the local authorities and the valuation office, bringing them together to try and at least understand. I think the piece here is very important. You know, I think it would be very good if the local authorities got that information at the same time as the Minister does in terms of the prelim, because at least then we can all work out the figures and be working off the same numbers. But I think in terms of the process under statute, it's the Commissioner makes a recommendation, the Minister decides and makes an order. Do you want to go through the... You can.
I'll do my best, and I have a lot of sympathy for the comments you made, but you know, the formula is complex, and it's complex to explain, and it's complex to understand, and I might get ready to bat it over to a colleague. But in terms of the aim of that particular provision, essentially what we're trying to do here in this legislation is to separate the standard national revaluation and the global revaluation, and of course the Irish water impact that's ongoing. And the way we've gone about it, we've crunched the numbers in the department, and I suppose it's safe to say we made a similar assumption to yourself that that a much more simpler process was possible, and to add back in at the end, but just the number, we couldn't get that to work numbers wise. It just we did an actuarial assessment of it, and it wasn't working out. So we reviewed then the formula in consultation with the valuation office, and the draft you have in front of you there in terms of the committee stage amendment. I know it's not straightforward, but that is what is proposed, and I suppose we're as confident as we can be that that is what will work. I'll just get the text of it here in front of me. I don't know, Sinead, if you want to say anything more on that.
Yes, one of the reasons we didn't separate it all together was if we did that, it would make the process of determining the ARV at the annual budget very difficult, very complex. If we pulled out the global income and worked your rate limitation order out in relation to non-global income, and it would have made the ARV process very complex. There are two elements to the formula that were changed according to what it was and what it currently stands in legislation. So what we propose. The portion G there is to allow for to account in the formula for possible leakage on appeals. So following a revaluation, relevant properties can appeal to the valuation tribunal, and the valuation may be revised downwards or upwards. But the original valuation has been factored into the local authority budget and to the rate limitation order amount. So the amendment we propose is that element G in the formula would account for that average percentage loss of income on appeal, and that it would be advised by the Valuation Commissioner to our Minister in the making of the order, because the Valuation Commissioner is independent in their functions, and that they are the only party that would be able to provide that data accurately. Okay, so that's the first proposed amendment. The second proposed amendment then is that second portion of the formula, the second set of brackets. At the moment, buoyancy from revised global valuation, so if a global valuation is revised upwards, or if a new global valuation, such as Irish Water this year, is added in, it couldn't be factored in the formula. So as we knew it, the local authority couldn't get the value of it. And this second portion of the formula is to allow for that buoyancy to be accounted for now. So basically it would raise the upper limit of the rate limitation order for those local authorities, which means they can get the benefit of a new valuation, or let's say if perchance ESB or Airgrid went up.
Okay, would you, Pat?
Probably not, but anyway.
Now,
I can, just in...
Yeah, on that one as well, that this is where I said there's huge consultations. So actually some rate practitioners from local authorities came into the department and are working on it. It is a very complicated system.
We went through all the options.
And then with the valuation office. So I think we're confident that actually to amend the formula that's already there is the best way to do it. Basically, we want to tweak it for two things: to account for the appeals and the leakage that can come from that, and the effect that can have then on the equity of the rates overall. And secondly, then this piece, which I think is really, critical because of the potential inequity for the counties that are being revalued at the same time as a global. I think it's a kind of an anomaly in the formula. But the best way to actually fix it was to try and fix the formula. And, the people that are very expert in that, we took their advice.
I'm not going to get into the nitty-bitty, but if you could send me out a practical example of it, because for today's purpose we'll allow it go through, but I would still like to go through it by the time it hits report stage next week. Just in relation to appeals leakage, we wouldn't have appeals leakage anyway in relation to the determination of an ARV. So why is that a factor here? It's just a question I'm asking, not having fully studied the whole lot of it.
Well, the situation you're in, if a local authority who's not undergoing revaluation is not subject to a rate limitation order, so they can adjust their ARV upwards or downwards as they see fit in order to earn a certain amount of rates income. The local authorities who are subject to a rate limitation order because they've been revalued in the previous year have no flexibility. So there will be an inevitable loss. They will be limited by the value of the rate limitation order, and their ARV will have to be set according to the rate limitation order. And this will give a little bit more flexibility. There'll be the rate limitation order amount will account for a percentage of leakage and will be a little bit higher. It's the upper limit to which they can raise their rates, but it gives them the flexibility to do so, which they currently don't have. And non-revaluation local authorities do have that.
But the AR is normally only applied after the appeals are known.
No, unfortunately, the appeals can take a significant period of time to work through.
Appeals can take a long time to work through in the valuation tribunal, and sometimes what happens is the tribunal might make a ruling on a particular business and its rates bill, or its valuation, I should say, and that can have retrospective effect. So then you might get some local authorities find themselves in a refund situation. That's assuming that any rates have been collected at all in an appeal situation. So the leakage on appeal provision that's proposed for insertion into the formula is simply to ensure that the revaluation remains revenue neutral, because the evidence suggests that when the appeals work through the system and when the impact of that is fully known, and it can take a number of years because of the volume of appeals, a revaluation is not in fact revenue neutral, and it's actually in some instances quite a considerable cost to individual local authorities. So to allow the formula to be adjusted so that they can, on the basis of the expertise of the Commissioner and the Commissioner's advice, that can be factored in immediately rather than dealing with the consequences a couple of years down the line.
Okay, I just tell the ratepayers in Wicklow who've all appealed their revaluation, don't be getting their hopes up to have it done by the end of the year. Because the indication was that it would be done by September.
Just to say on that, Deputy, that we are reviewing the appeals tribunal, and particularly, I suppose, in terms of just the volume, etc., of appeals that have come through. So that really increased, I suppose, with reval, and there's a little piece of work we'll do that, and I think it would be better to try and reduce that time, and so that the piece is more known. And I think in a way then we have the flexibility, if the risk of leakage on appeals is reduced because of that, because the appeals are quicker and that can be taken into account, and that would be a low element then of that extra ceiling that's needed. But I think just in the interim, it could be a significant loss to a local authority, and it's not the way the system was designed to be, because the RLO is being set on the basis of a figure that in actual fact may not materialise because of these appeals.
I'm going to ask one other question, and then I'll probably just leave it for today if you're willing to send me out the information before the thing. You mentioned potential buoyancies in relation to the global revaluation of both the ESB and the air network. There's no chance that the Minister or the Commission could use that buoyancy to balance the Irish water potential maybe deficit in local authorities.
So I think on that, look, that there's a couple of pieces to happen. The valuations have to happen, the notification has to happen separately. The department, in consultation with local authorities, has to work out the table of effect on a local authority by local authority basis. And then there are a number of levers available to the Minister, to the Government. But we need those figures first, because they're not, you know, I mean, this is I suppose, speaking into the future in terms of this, but it will be known very quickly. And it's, you know, in terms of my own agenda in here and interaction with local authorities, it's very, very high. So
so there potentially is a lever for the Minister to use the buoyancy, potential buoyancy, from a reval of both DSB and AIR to actually balance out a potential shortfall in Irish water funding for local authorities.
Well, I suppose, you know, each utility is valued independently of one another by the Commissioner, and completely independently of the department. When those, as Barry has said, the table is done, we understand the impacts on both the sector as a whole and on individual local authorities. Our role then as a department is to look at that in the context of the estimates process.
So you're not saying yes or you're not saying no?
Well, we would, you know, we would look at all of those things in the round. We would take other matters into account, other decisions that may or may not have an implication on the overall local authority funding piece.
we have that responsibility in terms of the local government financing on an annual basis. Just to say, I mean, there really isn't, and it is a very independent process. There's no information about it. The only information that we'd have from the Commissioner is kind of an explanation of some of the process, etc. But the notification will happen in July, and it's only at that stage that you can start to really put these figures on it. But that's something that we will have to work out and advise the Minister of the options that he has.
And that's one of them.
Potentially, I suppose.
Potentially. Okay, no, it's just, and then if you could send us out that full calculation so that we can try and get our heads around 80k before the 3rd of July.
Okay.
We'll be sorry to ask.
Just as an aside, Catherine, what is the average waiting time on the appeals process? Say, like a county like Westmeath, I think the reval happened last year, the year before. Is that county cleared now in terms of the appeals process for anything? Like, what is the average waiting time?
So I only have aggregate figures, but I know in terms of, and you can see it when you look at the amount of appeals that came in, 2014 they really increased. And since then, the amount of appeals that have been, so you're talking numbers of in the kind of low hundreds, increasing to over 1,000. And there were very good efforts to clear appeals, but as at the end of 2018, you know, you had over 1,000 appeals left on hand. So the backlog at the appeals tribunal, the backlog nationwide has, you know, is an issue for it. And I think that so we're really, it's a major piece of work that we're going to do, is to try and increase the capacity there in the valuation tribunal. So as I said, there's a review of that tribunal. Local authorities and other stakeholders were part of that process. It's underway, and I'd be hoping to close that off fairly quickly.
And the cumulative figure of worth of the, say, those 1,000 appeals, have you the figure on what that would be in terms of rates income from those 1,000 appeals?
I'm not sure if it's contained, if I have it here with me, but if I don't have it, I might be able to try and get an estimate of. I know there's, you know, there's figures. The local authorities, another piece that we're doing and working with the valuation office around the revisions. So I've seen figures on those, and you know, I think they've gone down now, the revisions. But look, I'll check that for you, Deputy, see if I can add a figure on that. I'm not sure if it's in there. I didn't notice it now when I was reading it.
And is it the same like the Tax Appeals Commission, that those figures are on ice, those rates are on ice while that appeals process is happening?
There is a provision in legislation that we refer to it as the payment pending appeal provision. There is a statutory obligation on ratepayers who have appealed their valuation to pay some or all of the rate as originally levied. The adherence to that or the enforceability of it, we do understand that ratepayers who have an appeal pending before the valuation tribunal, sometimes they can be reluctant pending the outcome of appeal. I presume people don't want to prejudice a potential appeal result by if they pay the full amount as levied. So it can be a challenge for local authorities to collect rates in that circumstance if there is an appeal pending, but it is the statutory position that payment pending appeal should proceed.
So that goes down to a case-by-case scenario of finance sections within local authorities as to how to handle that.
Yeah, and you know yourself that local authorities and rate collectors, they generally have a very good relationship, and they know the local situation better than it would be known in the department in terms of engagement with individuals.
If you could get us that figure on the cumulative network, because this is a wider question in terms of we had the valuations office next door, and we were discussing in terms of the kind of the slow pace of work in terms of conducting the reval nationwide anyway, and the impact on that. So, I mean, if you could get us that cumulative network, we'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. And just to say, Deputy, there's a couple of other things separate to the bill, so I would see this as an important building block, but in terms of the overall valuation process, in terms of revisions, etc., they've signed a contract, I think this week, the valuation office, to bring in extra resources, specifically to do the revisions in the next group of revals, and they've gone through a lot themselves. So the valuation office itself in terms of its work, and then this other piece of it, which is, you know, the valuation tribunal bit of it and how that operates, that, you know, that needs to be definitely needs to be modernised and made more efficient. So we're looking at those. They don't all necessarily need to be done in legislation, but you know, between ourselves, the department, the valuation office, and local authorities, we're really trying to work on all the other pieces that we can do procedurally.
Maybe just in conjunction with that, if we could get some kind of note in terms of the average waiting times, the process, because that is an important part of this process as well. Thanks, Chair.
Are we finished the questions for briefing? Yep. Okay. So we'll suspend the meeting just briefly, just to allow our Minister to come in and take a seat, and then once we reconvene, we'll start the bill. Is that agreed? Thanks. Okay. Meeting suspended just for a few moments. Thank you. Session. Okay, before we begin consideration of the bill, I propose to deal with some housekeeping matters. Item number 1 on the agenda. In order to ensure the smooth running of the meeting, any member acting in substitution for a member of the committee should formally notify the clerk now if they have not already done so. And you've already done so, Shane. Item 2, I propose that after approximately 2 hours of consideration of the bill, that we take a break for approximately 10 minutes. Is that agreed? If required, obviously. I would like to welcome to the meeting this morning Mr John Paul Phelan, TD, Minister of State at the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, with special responsibility for local government and electoral reform, and his officials to the meeting. Before we begin, I would ask members to please ensure their mobile phones are switched off or turned to airplane mode for the duration of this meeting, as that would maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting equipment. We will now proceed to consideration of the bill. So we're on to Section 1, Amendment 1 of the bill in the name of the Minister. Amendments 1 and 15 are related and they will be discussed together. Minister, you wish to move?
I do, and Chair, I want to also signal at this point that it's my intention to bring forward, I have to signal to the committee, amendments at report stage. I know it might have been discussed earlier on, but I have to outline the provisions of those amendments. In Section 10, it's about notification procedures. The amendment will enhance the existing provisions of Section 10 to ensure there is an obligation on ratepayers to register with their local authority and to notify them of any material changes in respect of rateable properties. Difficulty obtaining such information, for example, concerning a change of occupier or a change in the legal name of the business, has proven to be a barrier to effective levying and collection of rates for many local authorities, placing a clear statutory obligation on the occupier ratepayer, and this amendment will mitigate this. In Section 4, the amendment is in relation to the making of the rate process and the provision for additions and amendments to the valuation lists and changes to occupation to be immediately effective for ratings purposes. Currently, rates are levied on properties that exist on the valuation list on the date of the making of the local authority budget, and this means that additions of new properties or amendments to the valuation list during the year are not effective for rates until the following financial year and the following budget year. It is therefore proposed to amend Section 4 to allow for additions and amendments to the valuation list to become immediately effective for ratings purposes. A further amendment to Section 4 provides that where a person becomes the occupier or enters into an agreement which entitles them to occupy the relevant property on a date after the 1st of January in any year, a local authority shall charge that person a charge adjusted to reflect the remaining period of the year. Currently, the person in occupation on the date of the making of the rate is liable for the entire year, which is a bit of an anomaly that currently exists, and this amendment will seek to address. It's now proposed that the local authority should adjust the charge or demand issued to the person who was in occupation on the 1st of January or after the 1st of January, where there were more than one previous occupier in that year. Such that the charge for the full year is apportioned between the different occupiers over the year on a pro rata basis. And the introduction of a rates compliance certificate also, which will mean that if a ratepayer is seeking a certain licence from a particular local authority, he or she may be required to demonstrate to that same authority that the rates bill has either been paid or is subject to a payment plan. This measure is intended to facilitate a more joined-up approach within individual local authorities without being overly burdensome, and as a measure to encourage business to meet their rates obligations and to engage with local authorities. Subject to the drafting being finalised, this amendment will introduce the concept of this rates compliance certificate for the first time and can be kept under review in terms of its effectiveness. As you stated, Chair, I'm bringing forward a number of amendments, and you mentioned number 1, I think. No.
1 and 15 will be discussed together.
Okay.
1, 2, 15, sorry. Oh, sorry, 1 and 15. Sorry, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's a technical amendment. Number 1 is a technical amendment. It's included to cater for an amendment to Section 20. And Section 20 is being expanded to include 2 separate references to the Valuation Act of 2015. The amendment just says the Act of 2015, and it means the Valuation Amendment Act of 2015. It's a technical amendment.
doing 15 as well. Yeah.
15 then is currently rates are levied on properties that exist on the valuation list on the date of the making of the local authority budget. This means that the addition of new properties, this is referencing partly what we were saying, or what I was saying earlier, the addition of new properties or amendments to the valuation list during the year are not effective for rates until the financial year following the making of the budget. This amendment provides that additions and amendments to the valuation list to become immediately effective for rating purposes. That's Amendment 15A. 15B and C. Currently, there are differences in the timeframes allowed to public utilities undertaking and other ratepayers in the Valuations Act. There are no objectively justifiable reasons why different or more generous time periods should be given to public utility companies as opposed to private citizens or citizens with businesses. The current provisions in this regard appear to give rise to different treatment for different categories of ratepayers, and the amendments to Section 53 and 54 address this and ensure an equitable and more efficient, streamlined process for all ratepayers. And then Amendment 15D. This is about rate limitation orders, which I think was discussed earlier on as well, concerns Section 56 of the Valuation Act and amending the formula on which a rate limitation order is based. There are two elements to this formula. The rate limitation order, firstly, is introduced for local authorities following a revaluation process to ensure that the revaluation is revenue neutral. A revaluation results in a redistribution of commercial rates liability between ratepayers depending on the relative shift in the rental value of the property in relation to each other. In practice, however, local authorities lose out on income from successful appeals to the tribunal, meaning the revaluation exercise is not revenue neutral as intended. To mitigate this, it is proposed to amend the rate limitation order formula to allow for the inclusion of a factor that takes account of the level of appeals. It's proposed to add this factor so that the upper limit of rates income in the year following revaluation is raised slightly to take account for leakage on the appeal following revaluation. The factor will be agreed annually by the Minister and the Commissioner for Valuation. The second part is a further amendment to the formula for calculating rates limitations orders is also proposed. As currently worded, Section 56 has the unintended consequence of linking the standard revaluation programme, which is carried out on a cyclical basis, with the valuation cycle for global utility companies. This has a particularly acute impact for any county, any local authority undergoing a standard revaluation that coincides with the valuation of a new global utility. It means that the mandatory rate limitation order will limit the rates income from that utility. The globals are network-based operators with a national presence and include the telecommunications operators, ESB, Airgrid and Irish Rail. Irish Water will become a global utility in the coming months and is currently being revalued for this purpose. Those authorities being revalued currently stand to lose out from any additional rates income from Irish Water at a potential cost of significant sums, and these include at the moment in the revaluation process Fingal, Tipperary, Meath, Wicklow, Wexford, Louth, Cavan and Monaghan. And the addition of the second portion of the formula for the rates limitation order calculation will ensure that the buoyancy achieved for new or revised global utility valuations can be accounted for in the formula, which sets the upper limit for rates income in the following year. In other words, that it will accrue to the local authority and they won't have to balance it out with other existing ratepayers and therefore potentially see a rate reduction for some of the utility companies, which would be an unintended consequence of the current system.
Yeah, I suppose we had a fairly detailed conversation on amendment number 15, so there's no point getting through half the alphabet again and discussing it all over again. So I suppose we're willing to support this amendment here today with a view to maybe just having a closer look at it when the staff have agreed to send us on details of that formula and how A to K is actually worked out in practical things. We had a detailed discussion in relation to Irish Water and I don't know whether you were listening in or not, and the revaluation of, or the valuation that's taken place in relation to Irish Water, and then how that's distributed further down the line. And a county that had, in Wicklow had all its water assets valued and had them rateable, unlike some local authorities which didn't have theirs. And it does look like at this stage that we will be in a significant loss if it's done on a population base compared to what it is at the moment. And in fairness to the staff, have given us a clear indication of how that can be sorted out long term. And I did say, and I put it on the record in the last session, that the buoyancy generated by air and the ESB could potentially be used by the Minister to sort out the discrepancies in relation to Irish Water, just to put that on the record again. But at the moment, we want to be put on record that we might bring in amendments to this section at report stage.
Thanks, Pat. Owen?
Yeah, thanks very much, Minister, and no difficulty, certainly with the thrust of anything you've said, but maybe just two questions of clarification on 15D. Even though it's titled Power to Limit Rates Income, can I take it, I suppose, to put it as simply as possible, that this is really to ensure that the local authorities don't lose out financially, either from losing appeals or from the global revaluations of the utilities? That's essentially the nub of it. But with respect then to the conversation we had earlier about the length of time appeals are taking, and if you had a significant number of appeals in one local authority area that were lost, and if those appeals take 6 months or 12 months or whatever, clearly then there's a net impact on other ratepayers, because in order for the local authority not to lose out from losing those appeals and for the overall rates income to be revenue neutral, that means somebody else is going to have to pay more. So could you just talk us through, I suppose, how that will operate, but also how that will impact on the local authority, given that many of the people who are appealing the valuations, if it's an increase, don't necessarily pay the rates until the appeal is concluded? What then happens if other people who didn't originally get a rates increase then get hit with a rates increase in order to meet the revenue neutrality that's set out in this? Does that make sense?
I think so. I must say, admit that the formula myself.
I'm not so worried about the formula. I mean, it's more the principle behind the formula. I'm trying to get my head around.
The principle is. Sorry, is there other questions? I'll start with that while it's fresh in my head. The idea behind particularly 15D is, just as you said, to ensure that at the moment, the way the legislation is worded, it would allow for that situation to occur every number of years, where there's a revaluation of the utilities that coincides with a revaluation of X number of local authorities, that would see any potential increase, any potential buoyancy, to use that word, from revenues received in rates from the utilities offset against other rates received, existing rates received from existing businesses in their local area. And I suppose the main purpose of 15D is, as you said, to ensure that loophole is covered off. In terms of the point you make in relation to the appeals process is a very valid one, to be honest. There's been ongoing discussions, I suppose, between, well, not discussions, but there's been some talk between department officials and the valuations office to ensure that there's sufficient staffing levels present to allow for the valuations themselves to occur in a timely fashion, but also then the appeals themselves to be heard in a timely fashion. It was felt that when the revaluation process was introduced originally, as everyone knows, it was intended to be a revenue neutral change, and that any increases would be offset by decreases to other ratepayers in the local authority area. But also the length of time for appeals to be heard has meant, and all of you who deal with local authority members will know, that sometimes when the rates are agreed at budget meetings in the local authority, with the best of intentions by both members and officials, if there's a number of appeals outstanding and appeals that can be maybe had been successful, that it has led to a situation where they haven't always been neutral, you know, and that there has been a loss on the, or reduction on the books of the local authority in terms of the potential income that they thought they were going to accrue from commercial rates. So part of this Amendment 15 is an attempt to ensure that revenue neutrality will occur into the future. It doesn't occur fully at the moment. It depends, I suppose. It varies from local authority to local authority. So when we speak in the middle of Amendments 15 about the change that's going to allow for another figure, another factor to be used in terms of the amount of appeals and the different figure between what's agreed by local authority at budget time and what sometimes it can actually work out at. That's what the purpose of that particular section of the amendment is, to ensure that that shortfall is as small as possible and maybe eliminated fully. Now I hope that kind of answers a bit of what Deputy O'Brien asked in relation to Deputy Casey. I suppose we have the process of valuation for Irish Water hasn't been completed yet, but I understand, like, Wicklow would be, and this would only be me thinking off the top of my head, but there would be significant water infrastructure in Wicklow which serves a far greater region than just Wicklow, and that would obviously be a reason why Wicklow would have more commercial rate potential from Irish Water than most other local authorities. And I fully agree with you, and it is your entitlement, by the way, as you said, to bring forward amendment at report stage that Wicklow would see a commensurate benefit from those the Irish Water revaluations process when it is completed. But as to whether it will be offset, I mean, I think there is a further job to be done in the local government section in relation to how the local government fund in future is administered. And, you know, everybody here, and I think everybody here has been a member of a local authority at some stage, that the amount of movable parts that currently exist in the local authority fund, that many of them are grossly outdated at this stage. We need a more simplified, streamlined, but also more easily explainable to the public method of allocating local authority funding. And that might well mean that a situation like you outlined in relation to some of the buoyancy that's obtained from utility companies in the future, that it would be distributed in a different manner. But I don't want to kind of preempt whatever the ultimate outcome would be by saying, by completely agreeing with you, Deputy Casey.
Any further questions on that? No. Okay. So the question is, Section 1, Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, that amendment be made. Is that agreed? And the question is that Section 1 as amended stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 2, there's no amendments. So the question is, does Section 2 stand part of the bill? Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 3, no amendments. So, sorry.
Could I just register a no on number 2?
Yeah. Do you want to discuss Section 2?
No. But
So
the
Amendment 2,
amendments
is it?
2 to 7 are inclusive.
Yes, but that's down in Section 4.
All right, okay.
Okay.
Grand.
So there's no amendments in Section 3. So the question is, does Section 3 stand part of the bill? Is that agreed? Thank you. So we're now on to Section 4, Amendment number 2 in the name of the Minister. Amendments number 2 to 7 inclusive are related and they will be discussed together. You wish to move, Minister?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Amendment 2 is a technical amendment again to amend the definition of owner to link it with the established definition in rating practice. An earlier definition of owner in rating law exists in Section 14 of the Local Government Act of 1946, and it defines the owner as the person for the time being entitled to occupy a vacant hereditament at the time of the making of the rate. That's old rates wordage near there. Again, amendment number 3 is another technical amendment. It's preferable to describe the notice. This is about deleting in page 6, line 34, notice of, and substituting a rates bill stating. It's preferable to describe the notice that is being issued seeking payment of the rates as a rates bill. And rates bill is the term already used in current rating legislation, Article 25 of the Local Government Financial and Auditing Procedures Regulations of 2014. Rates bill is distinctive and self-explanatory and stands out from other statutory notices served by local authorities. Also, the number of rates bills that are issued vastly exceed any other statutory notice and are therefore worthy of a distinct title. Amendment 4 is to delete again. It's the same amendment in effect, to delete the notice and substitute the rates bill for exactly the same reasons that I've outlined already. Amendment 5 is the very same amendment in page 7, line 6, to delete a notice and substitute a rates bill, and the very same explanation. Amendment 6 in page 7 to delete in a prepaid registered letter. Yes, the number of rates bills served by local authorities is considerable, and some 5,000 to 6,000 in the case of Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown Council, and multiples of this in the case of Dublin City Council. In the event that a rates bill could not be served by ordinary post, the efficiency of the current rates recovery process would be impacted to a major extent, and this would result in significant delay in the recovery of rates and the need for local authorities to apply further resources for the purpose of serving rates bills upon occupiers of rated properties who have refused to accept the service of a rates bill by registered post. Amendment 7 again is a technical amendment to allow for a rates bill to be addressed to the owner or occupier if the name of the liable person is not known. Addressing a rates bill to the owner or occupier is likely to arise in only exceptional circumstances, but the existing ability of a rating authority to address a rates bill to an owner or occupier, which is in Regulation number 42 of SI 508/2002, which is superseded by Regulation 28 of SI 226 of 2014, should be retained in the new Local Government Rates Bill 2018, notwithstanding that it is not possible to issue legal proceedings for the recovery of rates without identifying the name of the occupier.
Mick?
It seems to me that the majority of those amendments are fine. They're basically technical amendments. The one that seems to me to be an exception to that is number 2. I indicated opposition to it there. I was talking about Amendment 2 rather than Section 2. But maybe before I register that position, I should just clarify, so I have a question. My understanding of Amendment 2 here is that it changes the provision of the vacant property charge in the case of a vacant property from the owner being charged to whoever it is entitled to occupy it at that point in time. Right? Is that correct? And what would the Minister say to the assertion that that tends to benefit landlords over occupiers at any one time? And is there any compelling logic as to why that change is needed in his view?
Oh yes, Grant. Thanks, Chair. Just in relation to Amendment number 6, my heart goes out to these local authorities who have so many commercial bills to send out. It's just causing financial constraints to send them in prepaid envelopes. Wish we had that many in Wicklow to send out. Just in relation to number 7, Amendment number 7, the purpose of this amendment is, I'm not 100% sure, is to take the liability away from the person who was actually using the property and putting that liability back onto the owner stroke occupier. Because my understanding is that if the owner of the property or occupier, I think, informs the local authority of the person who's renting that property, their name and address, that the liability stays with them, it doesn't revert back to the owner occupier. If that is the case, why is this amendment needed if the liability is not transferable to the owner occupier?
You asked the question again. Sorry, no, I
yes, sorry.
Started.
Okay. So my understanding of the regulation at the moment, if I own a property and I rent it out, once I give that information to the local authority, who that person is, their address and their details, my liability ceases. So what I'm wondering then, why is this amendment needed? Because If the liability ceases with who is ever renting that property, why then do you need, where the name of the liable person concerned cannot be ascertained by reasonable inquiry, a rates bill under this section may be addressed to the occupier stroke owner of the property if there is no liability on that owner occupier.
Okay.
Any other questions? Nope. Minister.
I do. I've just written down that, sorry, Chair. Yeah, the first, in relation to Deputy Barry, the compelling case, I suppose, is that commercial rates are due from occupiers of commercial premises, not from owners. Now, often it is the case. In fact, I would say nearly in most examples, the owners are the occupiers, particularly of small operations around the country that pay commercial rates. But the reason why that particular amendment and that change is there, and the compelling case for it, is that if we say, for example, somebody owns a premises and they rent it to a person who has a business in it, and the person with the business in it decides to cease trading for whatever reason, they are, as occupier, you know, in terms of how rates legislation has always operated, they are the person on whom the liability should fall. That's the compelling case, not the owner. I mean, it's not, rates are not a property tax or anything else other than a charge on commercial activity to fund local authority for local authority activities in their area, and that's I suppose the basis under which commercial rates law has always operated. In terms of why it's necessary, amendment number 7, I suppose it's just clearing off, or it's for the very rare cases involving those who haven't registered. I mean, a legal validity to a rates bill issued to the owner. Yeah, exactly. Because at present, if the owner cannot, or if the operator cannot be ascertained, I suppose the next logical fallback, generally through whatever auspices or arms of the state that people register their properties, whether the registration authority in particular, it is where the rates authority would go next in terms of looking for where the bill should be served. This is for the very rare cases. You're right to point out, Deputy, that most local authorities, you know, this wouldn't occur very often, I think is what the way you put it yourself. But it's trying to ensure that there is a specific process that the rateable authority can go through in order to ascertain who the actual occupier of the premises is.
Further questions?
Point of clarification on that one, and I can understand the logic that's you're presenting there, but looking at what I'm reading here is still saying, even though I provide the local authority with all the information that's needed, this amendment still is sort of saying that in the absence of him absconding and disappearing, that then I'm next in line. Does it put back the onus of the liability back? You know, I'm just concerned why this is worded. It looks like the liability ends up.
Yeah, that isn't the intention, and it isn't the effect either of this change. That it isn't putting that onus of payment back on where it shouldn't lie already. It's just about a process of ensuring that the local authority can try and get to the bottom of who the occupier is. That's.
I just have a slight concern that it does expose an owner to that charge, because it doesn't say that here. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't actually say that here.
Yeah, the liability doesn't change. That's just conferring the liability still rests with and go back to Deputy Barry's kind of first question, with the occupier still the liable person. But it's just a method of trying to ensure that the rates bill is served, and like if the local authority doesn't always have accurate information as to who the occupier is, and it's another attempt in a very small limited number of cases maybe to get that information, but it doesn't reverse the liability in any way that currently exists on occupiers over owners.
Okay, any further questions? No. Okay, so section 4, question is that section 4, amendment 2 in the name of the minister, that amendment be made. That's agreed, thank you. Section 4, amendment 3 in the name of the minister, already discussed with amendment 2. The question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 4, amendment 4 in the name of the minister, already discussed with 2. Question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 4, Amendment 5, in the name of the Minister, already discussed with Amendment 2. Question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Section 4, Amendment 6, in the name of the Minister, already discussed with Amendment 2. Question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 4, Amendment 7, in the name of the Minister, already discussed with Amendment 2. The question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Question is that Section 4, as amended, stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Section 5, Amendment 8, in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien. Deputy O'Brien's not here. Deputy Castle's here in his place. Is that amendment being made?
Yes, we're present that amendment.
Do you wish to discuss?
Just, look, in respect of the amendment put down for Section 5, earlier we had a discussion on the impact on businesses of revaluation and the significant changes in the bills that will be associated with that, the increases that will be associated with that, the fact that, as Barry brought forward to us, that in the last few years appeals by businesses have gone from just a couple of hundred to thousands, and the fact that there is actually 1,000 appeals on the books as we speak. And Minister, the impact of a revaluation, which of course you know very well, being caused by the fact that the Valuation Office have not been keeping pace over the last number of years with the process as well. And the impact then on a business that is subject to that, which has then been subject to a significant increase, is massive. And it can be hugely detrimental to a small business. So the thrust of the amendment being put forward here is to allow for a kind of staggered payment basis in respect of rates, and so that a business, rather than being hit with one significant rate increase, is allowed to do that over a period of time. Look.
Shane, Minister.
Deputy Castles is right. I mean, there isn't a member in the House, whether they're in the government or anywhere else, that doesn't get a lot of queries from constituents that, particularly in local authority areas, that have undergone the revaluations process. You're right to point out the issue of the number of appeals and delay in appeals. But we also have I suppose, significant responsibility to ensure commercial rates brings in €1.4 billion annually into the local authority sector, which, if that figure were to be significantly adjusted in a downward direction, would have very serious consequences for our local government system as a whole. It's my intention in the autumn to deal specifically with the valuation side of this whole process, in the sense that we all know, as practitioners, rates and valuations are two sides of the same coin. The Valuations Commissioner operates completely independently of government and of indeed any elected politician, be they local or national. And that's important, because the job that they have to do should be completely independent of politics one way or another. But equally, the Oireachtas has a responsibility to review from time to time the legislation that underpins the valuations process, and which is why I'm determined that in the fall of this year we will do it. And there are a number of, I won't use the word anomalies, but there are a number of particular pinch points in certain sectors of the economy and of business, particularly in maybe in smaller rural communities where you have small villages that only have a business or two, that in effect can often be a social service as much as a commercial operation. And we have other arms of government that are constantly, and I'm thinking of Minister Ring's department and indeed of the local government section as well, that are trying to do their utmost to improve the quality of life for people in these communities around the country. And at the same time, sometimes it can seem the case that commercial rates provisions don't have the same interests at heart, and they don't. There's a conflict there, I suppose. The commercial rates it's designed to ensure that there's a level playing field and an even system operated across the country in terms of how we collect commercial rates. But equally, we have a desire, and a stated political desire, and it's not just in isolated rural areas, it's in some maybe more deprived or more village-like urban centres that exist in all of our towns and cities across the country too, whereby smaller business premises have closed over the years, and there is a desire politically across all sides for those local businesses to be retained and to ensure that certainly the valuations rules or anything around them wouldn't be a contributory factor to the closure of such businesses. So that's why, again, in the autumn of this year, it is very much my intention that we would have a valuations piece of legislation. The Department, just to answer specifically the amendment that proposed by Deputy Castles in the name of Deputy O'Brien, the Valuations Acts provide for the revaluation of all rateable property within a rating authority area, so as to reflect changes in value due to economic factors such as business turnover, differential movements in property values, or other external factors, and changes in the local business environment. The Department has been informed that the general outcome of the revaluations conducted to date by the Valuations Office has been about 60% of ratepayers have had their liability reduced following the revaluation, and 40% increased, and which is expected to be replicated elsewhere as the national programme advances. In relation to reported cases where the rates liability has increased by multiples of the original bill, the Department has been informed that while such increases may have occurred in some isolated cases, increases of this level would be a rarity. Possible reasons for significant increases where they occur would be that the valuation of some of these properties had not been revised to take account of improvement, extensions, etc., for some considerable time, or where the valuations were historically low in comparison to the general level of valuations on the valuation list. Additionally, some properties may have undergone extensive refurbishment, and this was not reflected in the valuation immediately before the revaluation that is now in train. It's not the purpose of a revaluation to increase the total amount of commercial rates collected by the local authorities. Indeed, Section 56 of the Valuations Acts of 2001 to 15 provides that the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, having obtained the consent of the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, is obliged to make an order directing a rating authority to limit the overall amount of income it could raise through rates in the year following a revaluation to the total amount of rates liable to be paid in the previous year, plus buoyancy arising from valuations determined in the year of a revaluation of newly constructed property, and adjusted for inflation as measured by the CPI. Rate limitation orders have been made in each local authority that has undergone the revaluation to date, and further orders will be made in respect of future revaluations as they arise. Ultimately, any undue or contrived delay in achieving up-to-date valuations in line with current property rental values would result in unfairness in the levying of rates. A proposal to phase in increases in valuations over a number of years would either see the shortfall in rates income being made up by other ratepayers in the form of higher rates bills, or would be absorbed by the local authorities. So in light of that, it's not my intention to accept this amendment, but I do believe that we have to go in some detail in the fall of this year the valuations system, and there's already a review which I would have referred to in a couple of parliamentary answers of some of the exemptions that currently exist under the Valuations Act. That review is underway, and we should ensure as an Oireachtas that we have legislation taking on board that review And I think that we can do that in the fall of this year. It needn't necessarily be a huge piece of legislation, but it could deal with some of the issues that I think Deputy O'Brien's amendment here is trying to address, which is to avoid a situation whereby sometimes there can be severe increases on individuals. Sometimes there is significant delay in the hearing of appeals. Sometimes there is the whole process of revaluation itself is a little bit slower than we would like, and I think that that particular piece of legislation we should be able to address some of those concerns.
Thanks, Minister. Pat?
Yeah, I'll just maybe speak on this briefly and put on the record that I'm a commercial ratepayer, just so that everybody knows. Wicklow went through, I suppose, this revaluation process this year, and the month of March, I had to say, was exceptionally busy for my office. I think the purpose of this is to try and, take the shock out of a revaluation system, which, as you say, 40% of properties did receive an increase.
They weren't the ones ringing you, I'd say, no?
The increased ones were.
Yeah,
the 60% weren't. No, 60% weren't. Yeah. But in fairness, while you mentioned extensions and improvements and all that, the critical point here was that a revaluation wasn't carried out in Wicklow in the last 30 years. Yeah. That's the fundamental problem, is that revaluations don't happen often enough. And I had several properties on to me that were looking at maybe 300 to 400% increases for no reason that their location, where they were located, the complete street and everything improved so much in that period of time, and they sat still, had no improvements, no anything, but they're hit with a 400% increase. And it's very hard for a small business to take that hit and ask them to take that hit in 1 year. And what this amendment is trying to do is trying to harmonise that over a period of time. And I think we will be pushing this because in the absence of the legislation you're talking about in relation to the Valuation Office, a small piece of harmonisation like this is required. In my own experience, in Wicklow, when we had to harmonise the town council rates with the local authority rates, we had similar situations here where we had properties coming down and properties going up. So it is possible to harmonise rates over a period of time when you can look at the figure that you're dealing with at the end of the day. I went into family businesses that were on their knees when they got their revaluations. They couldn't. But to say that there's nothing there to assist the small business to deal with the shock in relation to a revaluation, that is not of their own making. This is the state's fault. It doesn't have a revaluation. I don't know when Wicklow was done. I think it was 40 years or something. And then my own business has suffered a 100% increase in the revaluation. But that's because we hadn't done a revaluation over 20 years. So I think we as a party will be pushing this amendment because in the absence of what you're talking about, Minister, there's nothing there to assist small and medium sectors to deal with the shock that they're faced with a revaluation.
Carol, can I say?
Shane, work away, yep.
Sorry, thanks, Carol. Yeah, just on that point from Deputy Casey, and the Minister talked about the general outcome of the previous revals had been a 60% reduction for ratepayers, 40% of businesses experienced an increase. And you said that there was only some isolated cases where significant increases and they were a rarity. Minister, in my own area, in the general northeast area, Meath has gone through the reval this year, Wicklow, last year Westmeath and Longford. I have all the local papers from that period of time kept. And they went down to individual business. They were certainly not rarities. They certainly were not. And if you're being told that, you're being advised wrong. And certain types of business, such as public houses and so forth, were hit with multiples of increases. And that has the potential to close those businesses. And that's what they're seeking to address. People want to pay the charges that are being levied upon them. It's how, and you've admitted that yourself in your answer to me, that phasing arrangement should be something that should be looked at, and that's what we're pushing here. Because as Deputy Casey has said, this scenario is developing because of the tardiness of the Valuations Office. And I've tackled them on this in terms of when they're before the Public Accounts Committee, and the sheer lack of pace in how they are doing their job is causing this to come in situ in the first place with the time frames. This has already been admitted and accepted this morning, and you've said yourself that the appeals process and the delays there are adding to this as well. So as we've said already, we're pressing this, Cathaoirleach.
Yeah, I acknowledge what Deputy Castle said there in relation to the issues with vintners. As I understand it, the Valuations Commissioner engaged in a process with, I'm not sure which, or was it a number of the vintner groups, whereby some of those difficulties were ironed out, or agreement was reached, which was more acceptable, I suppose, to the vintners. Following a number of requests of the Valuations Commissioner in the last number of months, I know that he has already indicated that, particularly in relation to the fuel retail sector, that there's an ongoing consultation and engagement between the Valuations Office and the representative group of the fuel retail sector. It's the IPRA, I think. And the Commissioner has agreed to consider adjustments to the valuation scheme for service stations, including changes that will result in reductions in valuations based on detailed evidence to be provided by the Irish Petrol Retailers Association. So that process is underway at present. More broadly, also, the Valuations Office engages in ongoing consultation and engagement with other sectoral groups regarding their methodology and revaluations in the context of the revaluation programme. And in that context, the Commissioner has also committed to fully examining any additional detailed information provided by sporting or equestrian bodies, because a number of members of both houses would have experienced issues with sporting bodies and equestrian sporting bodies also, whereby significant increases following the revaluation process had been thrown up. So the Valuations Commissioner has, again, in this particular example, agreed that where these services provide significant community and voluntary services, along with commercial activities, that he would be open to considering adjustments to the valuation scheme for such sectors, including changes that will result in reductions in valuations based on detailed evidence to be provided by the sectoral representative bodies. So I welcome the fact that the Valuations Commissioner himself is, well, first of all, he engaged with the vintners' representatives, the ongoing engagement with the service station representative groups, but also now these sporting bodies, to try to iron out some of the significant issues that have emerged in the revaluation process across the country. I mean, I've always felt that it's absolutely crazy that, voluntary bodies being levied with commercial rates, when there are certain exemptions that still exist under our valuations legislation to allow what on the face of it seem like perfectly commercial activities that don't pay rates. And that's why, just to return to my earlier point, that we need a valuations piece of legislation in the autumn of this year. But I also feel that engagement has the possibility of dealing with some of the points that this particular amendment number 8, is actually speaking about. Also, to reiterate to members that there is currently a full review, staffing-wise, I think, in terms of additional numbers that might be needed to ensure that the revaluations process itself is speeded up. Deputy Casey's right. I don't know the exact figure for Wicklow, but it could well be 30 or 40 years since the last revaluation happened. The target at the moment is to try and get that down to roughly every 7 years. That in itself would ensure that we don't have the significant spikes that can emerge, and that every member of the Oireachtas would have been presented with different examples across the country. But in light of that, I'm not in a position, as I said earlier, to accept this amendment, while I accept, I suppose, a lot of the issues behind it, but I think some of them are being dealt with and will be dealt with in the legislation to come in the fall of the year.
Okay, you're pressing the amendment? Okay. So the question is that Section 5, Amendment 8, in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien, that amendment is being pressed. Those in favour say Thaw. Those against say Neil. Deputy O'Brien, did you?
I'm abstaining.
You're abstaining. Okay, the question is lost. So the question is that vote all. Okay. Question is on Amendment 8, is that the amendment be made? And on that question, a division has been challenged. Pursuant to standing orders, the division will now be taken by the clerk.
Minister. Chairperson.
Neil.
Deputy Barry. Deputy Casey. Deputy Castles. Deputy O'Brien.
Abstain.
Is lost. So the question is that Section 5 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 6, no amendments have been made. The question is that Section 6 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 7, no amendments. Question is Section 7 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 8, Amendment 9, in the name of the Minister. Minister, you wish to press the amendment?
Yes. It's a technical amendment again, Chair. It's to add at a reasonable rent to the definition of vacant property in this section. Section 14 of the Local Government Act of 46 includes at a reasonable rent as a condition for a refund of rates on vacant property, and the definition is part of established rates practice.
Any questions on that? No. Okay. Amendment 10, in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien. Deputy Castles, you wish to press the amendment?
Yes, we're pressing it. I suppose it's just a very simple one in terms of similar to the public consultation process that would take place for things like LPT and so forth, that if there were the abatement of rates, that there would be allowed for transparency, a similar public consultation process as well.
Minister, you wish to comment?
Yeah, I'm a bit divided on where I stand in a sense on this particular one. I understand the motivation behind it, but the budgetary process that a local authority undergoes is already a kind of a tight time period, and like it's also the case that elected representatives are given a mandate to make decisions. There's often, and I often get it myself, complaints from members of local authorities that their hands are tied too much in relation to issues, and in relation to the making of budget, they have a pretty free hand in relation to how they operate and how they vote and decisions that they take. So at present, the legislation governing rates provides that a local authority may provide up to 100% relief on rates where a premises is vacant, either due to renovation or repairs, or because the owner is unable to find a tenant. Outside the city councils of Dublin, Cork and Limerick, which historically had separate legal provisions enabling a refund of 50% on vacant properties, the practice has generally been for elected members to give 100% relief. The introduction of the Local Government Reform Act of 2014 gave discretion to the elected members of individual authorities to vary the level of rates, refunds that apply in individual local authority areas within the authority's administrative area. The lack of any charge on vacant premises may act as a disincentive for the property to be put to its best use. Vacancy refunds also introduce a level of uncertainty regarding the revenue to the local authority that the local authority can collect. Section 8 provides that a local authority may provide for a temporary abatement for vacant properties, subject to any maximum relief which may be specified by the Minister, to ensure that all property owners, other than those whose rates liability would be below a de minimis threshold, may make some level of payment to the local authority. The section allows the Minister to prescribe that the maximum level of relief can be further reduced by individual local authorities. To incentivise the elected members, it's proposed that the revenue accruing from any further reduction in the vacancy refund beyond this level will be added to the general municipal allocations of the municipal districts in the local authorities. A public consultation provision as envisaged by this amendment would be similar to that which is in place in advance of the annual setting by the local authority of the local adjustment factor in respect of LPT. The public consultation on the LPT adjustment factor enhances the strengthened relationship between the local authorities and local electorates. I accept that a public consultation during the development of a scheme for the abatement of rates on vacant properties can similarly strengthen the process for the development of a rates abatement scheme. And the amendment as drafted, however, inserts a new regulation making power for the Minister under subsection 8.13. Subsection 8.3 provides regulation making power for the Minister for the purposes of the section. And it would appear that this amendment would be more proper to be located under subsection 3 of section 8. So in the circumstances and pending redrafting of the amendment to be inserted into subsection 8.3, I'm happy to accept the thinking behind the amendment, but we will have to redraft and insert it in the right place for report stage.
Owen?
Yeah, no, I mean, notwithstanding what the Minister said, it's eminently sensible, and I mean, there are pros and cons to an abatement decision. Obviously, the pros is the benefit to the local businesses or the ratepayers, but the negatives is the potential loss of revenue to the local authority and what that means. And actually, I think having a consultation process would allow you to tease some of that out. We did find a way in South Dublin County Council when I was on it to effectively have an abatement, even though that's not what it was called. We operated the kind of the survey for the small and medium-sized businesses, and it worked quite well. But what we did find is the level of take-up from small and medium-sized businesses was quite low, and in fact, it was difficult for us to get the injection of cash back out to the small and medium-sized enterprises. If you'd had a public consultation, that might have actually, in the first and second years, increased the take-up of that. Now, for some businesses, it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was certainly better than nothing. So I'd be minded to support whether it's this amendment or a superior drafted amendment by the officials, but I think the principle is a good one.
Shane?
Minister, we're like, I mean, you accept the trust of what we're trying to do, so I mean, we're prepared to work with you at report stage, if so be it, to achieve that in terms of you accepting that as well, and that it would be inserted within the context of the bill.
Yeah, we'll be we'll be looking to reword and put it into a different subsection, but the idea of what it's about is accepted.
Okay.
Okay.
Once you've raised it anyway, you can raise it at report stage as well anyway.
Okay. Great.
So is it being withdrawn, or
Grand coalition now.
do you wish to withdraw, Shane?
Yes, well, it has to be. If it has to be
We'll formally come to that,
withdrawn,
then we'll do
yeah.
that, okay? So Section 8, Amendment 9, in the name of the Minister, the question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Great. Section 8, Amendment 10, in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien, the question is that amendment be made, or is that being withdrawn?
We withdraw on the basis of the understanding of what we've discussed. Yeah.
Thanks, Shane. Okay, the question is that Section 8, as amended, stamp part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 9, there are no amendments. The question is Section 9 stamp part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 10, no amendments. The question is that Section 10 stamp part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 11, Amendment 11, in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien. Shane, you wish to press the amendment?
Yes, Gaherla, we're pressing the amendment that seeks to make regulations with regard to an inability to pay clause for rateable premises. And again, in our earlier discussions, the Minister spoke in terms of the money that was brought in from rates, which is some £1.5 billion, which is funding 34% of the total local government budget. It's a significant amount of money. It's increased by some 14% over the last decade alone. I've consistently said, both in the Chamber and in different committees as well, my fear is that it's becoming a significant crutch for local authorities in terms of how they seek and source their funding. And within the context of that, every year, even though the Minister will actually ask for councils to restrain in terms of any increases and to apply that restraint and to make sure that they are fair on businesses, that some councils in seeking to do works beyond what is just the norm of councils and to try and do more imaginative things, will seek the only source of funding that's available, and that's rates, and that does cause inability for some people to pay. And at a time when we're trying to promote local business outside of the main city centres. And we've seen that. We've seen the impact on very small towns and villages throughout Ireland, and anyone canvassing during the European elections will have seen that, that there is a huge impact. And I know the Minister mentioned Deputy or Minister Ring earlier in terms of what he's trying to do, but the nuts and bolts, if you don't have the cash to open your business because of debts, that's killing town centres. And it really is. That there are certain towns doing very well and powering along, but there are lots that are not. And that imbalance is growing. That disparity between the big and the smaller ones is growing. And I think within the context of that, and this inability to pay clause should be inserted. I pay tribute to directors of finances throughout the country who actually are trying on an ad hoc basis to work with premises who are experiencing difficulties. And there are councils, chief executives and directors of finances who are trying their best to make sure that those who are experiencing difficulties are given a fair shake. But I think we should put it on a statutory footing in terms of acknowledging the impact, and that there should be an inability to pay clause inserted.
Minister.
I suppose I would kind of argue that in a sense, because of the provisions in this legislation which will allow for those discussions and where a ratepayer has entered into an agreed payment plan, effectively, you know, the ability to pay clause is being inserted, albeit by a different mechanism to some extent. The provisions under Section 11 of the bill are based on the provisions of the Taxes Consolidation Act, which provide for the addition of interest to unpaid taxes to the Revenue Commissioners, and in this respect aims to see rates treated on a similar basis. This measure is proposed as a further incentive to promote compliance with the payment of rates. Currently, there is no legal provision for the imposition of a penalty in respect of the late payment of rates. The non-availability of a sanction, such as the charging of interest on late payments of rates, is regarded by rating authorities as a major weakness in rating law. It is considered that the charging of interest on the late payments of rates would be an effective method of accelerating collection within the current year and improving cash flow. The interest would accrue from the 1st of January of the following year and only apply where a ratepayer refuses to enter into an agreed payment plan with the local authority. As such, the introduction of interest on unpaid rates is focused on incentivising engagement with the local authority rather than increasing the income of local authorities. Local authorities have a long-standing record, as the Deputy has outlined, of working closely with businesses experiencing difficulty in the payment of commercial rates. And as I said, one of the main provisions here in this legislation is that the penalty will only apply where people don't go into that agreed payment plan with local authorities. And generally speaking, local authority officials do use discretion with regard to genuine cases of people who are and businesses that have an inability to pay. I do have reservations, I suppose, about the creation of a statutory position whereby inability to pay is put on the books in the manner in which proposed by this particular amendment. And I do think that level of discretion should continue to be operated by the council officials, and particularly in relation to agreements that are reached with businesses that may be in difficulty but that have an agreed plan to pay their commercial rates over a particular period of time.
Shane?
I suppose, Cahir, look, that's the essence of it. Just the last few comments by the Minister, and I agree. In a number of cases throughout the country, chief executives and directors of finances are showing that discretion, but it's not always the case. I know in my own county we have a chief executive who's a former director, former head of finance. Our own head of finance would work closely, and it works well, but that is not the experience nationwide. And I think that it needs to be established, because I think outside of the area of the Greater Dublin area that is experiencing growth and is doing well, there's a whole different area that has to be examined, and I think putting on a statutory footing is something that actually focuses the mind in respect of the severe pressures that some people are under.
Do you wish to press the amendment?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry, Owen.
Just two brief comments. I have sympathy with the intent of the amendment, but I don't support the mechanism in which it's been done. I mean, again, keep in mind any such exemption could potentially have a significant impact on the revenue coming into a local authority, or more importantly, it could have a significant impact on all local authorities at a period of economic downturn, for example. And I always think that, like, this is part of the difficulty with a rate system, is its value is it gives local authorities a consistent source of revenue irrespective of the economic cycle. The difficulty is, of course, for businesses, that creates a challenge, and nobody, and lots of people have tried, has yet found a way to marry those two things. I would much prefer, for example, a mechanism where local authorities at particular points in time could use the abatement to make democratic decisions about if there is a particular problem with a particular sector or a particular location, in full knowledge of the revenue consequences for them, to have some mechanism to do that, because at least then you'd be able to make those local decisions. I would worry that even with the best will in the world, if the minister were to make such regulations, they might not have the ability to be applied sensibly in each local authority area. So I get what the deputy is coming with, but I don't think his amendment solves the particular problem. I do know, for example, at the depth of the recession, in a significant number of local authorities, local rates officers and managers took very pragmatic decisions to keep businesses alive. And in fact, they were beaten up by some politicians in this House because the rates collection level fell significantly. Now, Shane is right, that didn't happen everywhere. But I just think anything which potentially reduces the revenue of local authority without them having some control over, particularly the elected members, we should caution against. And it's on that basis I won't support the amendment.
The value of this debate and the comments by Deputy O'Brien highlights the impact, where he mentioned the impact that this amendment would have on the revenue local authority. That highlights the wider problem that we're having in terms of the dependency of local authorities and the growing dependency of local authorities on rates as its main source of income, and the challenge faced by councillors then in the autumn period when they are seeking, especially newly elected councillors, to push the boundaries of what local authorities are doing, and they suddenly realise that the avenues of fundraising are then falling on the commercial rate system, and that is the actual essence of the problem here.
So the question is that amendment, section 11, amendment 11 in the name of Deputy Darragh O'Brien, that amendment be made. Those in favour say Tá. Those against say Níl. Níl. The question is lost. Section 11, the question is that section 11 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 12, Amendment 12 in the name of the Minister. Amendments 12 and 13 are related and will be discussed together. Minister, you wish to push?
Thank you. They're all technical amendments. Amendment 12 is to allow the Minister to prescribe the form of the confirmation of paid or unpaid rates, e.g. a certificate. This is to ensure consistency across the sector and that all local authorities use the same form of confirmation. That's Amendment 12. Amendment 13, again, is technical. It deletes the definition of sale in this section, as sale is already defined in Section 12 and is not referenced in Section 13. The definition is not required there. And again, Amendment 14 is a technical amendment. It's a grammatical amendment in page 15, line 4, to delete section and substitute act.
17, we haven't come to that one yet. Okay. So, any questions to the Minister? No. Okay. So, question is: Section 13, Amendment Section 12, Amendment 12, in the name of the Minister, that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Question is: Section 12, as amended, stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 13, Amendment 13, in the name of the Minister, already discussed with Amendment 12. The question is that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. Question is that Section 13 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 14, no amendments. The question is that Section 14 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 15, no amendments. Question is Section 15 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 16, no amendments. Question is that Section 16 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 17, Amendment number 14, in the name of the Minister. Minister, you wish to press?
I do wish to press, as previously discussed or moved. I move, yeah.
Okay, any comments on it? No. Question is Section 17, Amendment 14, in the name of the Minister, that amendment be made. Is that agreed? Thank you. The question is Section 17, as amended, stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 18, no amendments. Question is Section 18 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 19, no amendments. Question is Section 19 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 20, Amendment 15, in the name of the Minister. It's a new section already discussed with Amendment 1. The question is that the new section be there inserted. Is that agreed? Question is Section 20 be deleted from the bill. Is that agreed? Section 21, no amendments. Question is Section 21 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 22, no amendments. Question is Section 22 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. Section 23, no amendments. Question is Section 23 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Section 24, no amendments. Question is Section 24 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Then we're on to the schedule. So the question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Is that agreed? Thank you. So we're on to the title. So that this be the title to the bill, an act to revise the law relating to the collection of rates in relation to certain properties, to provide for the establishment and maintenance of database of those properties in the state, to provide for the amendment and repeal of certain enactments, and to provide for related matters. Is that agreed? Thank you. So, in accordance with Standing Order 90, the following message will be sent to the Clerk of the Dáil. The Select Committee on Housing, Planning and Local Government has completed its consideration of the Local Government Rates Bill 2018 and has made amendments thereto. I would like to thank the Minister and his officials for attending.
One thing that I have to get on the record again before the
So close.
I'm proposing to bring forward via this rates bill additional amendments to the Residential Tenancies Acts 2004 and 2019. The changes relating to the recently enacted Section 37 of the 2019 Residential Tenancies Amendment Act are primarily technical, but also to close off a potential means of circumventing the application of aspects of the 2004 Act, such as registration, dispute resolution and rent increase restrictions in rent pressure zones to student-specific accommodation occupied under licence. Technical amendments are also proposed to clarify that the student-specific accommodation provisions and the provisions requiring annual registration can come into force separately. The student-specific accommodation provisions are intended to commence in mid-July, prior to the late commencement of the provisions requiring annual registration that are expected to commence in Q1 of 2020. So hence the urgency to address this issue before the summer recess. The 2009 Act also amended Section 19 of the 2004 Act to specify the types of substantial refurbishment works warranting a higher rent level that could qualify for exemption from the rent increase restrictions that operate in rent pressure zones. As protected structures are unable to qualify for exemptions on the basis of works to improving their building energy rating, it is proposed to further amend Section 19(5)(a) of the 2004 Act to allow the first rent set under the tenancy of the protected structure dwelling not rented in the previous 12 months to be the market rent. It is also proposed to make a small technical amendment for consistency in the wording of Section 3(1)(a) of the 2004 Act by replacing include with apply to. Sorry?
Is the yeah in the amendment or separate to the amendment?
I said wasn't yeah. I'd also like to signal to the committee my intention to bring forward amendments to the Planning and Development Acts of 2000 to 2018 at the next stage. Amendment to Section 31A of the and consequential amendments to Sections 31AQ and 31AR of the Regional Spatial Economic Strategies. This is a time-critical amendment which arises in the context of the establishment of the new Office of the Planning Regulator on the 3rd of April 2019. Section 31A of the Planning and Development Act 2000, as amended, provides for ministerial directions regarding regional spatial economic strategies. As currently enacted under Section 31A, provides only that the Minister can issue a direction on foot of a recommendation made to him or her by the Office of the Planning Regulator. This cannot be satisfied in the 3 RSES processes currently underway, given that each commenced prior to the establishment of the Office of the Planning Regulator. This amendment provides for transitional arrangements to ensure that the Minister has a robust legal basis to issue a direction to a regional assembly if necessary. The proposed amendments will apply only in respect of the 3 current RSESs that commenced prior to the Office of the Planning Regulator being established. Section 31A and related sections 31AQ and 31AR will remain valid in the cases of RSESs made in the future. And I also want to flag a further minor technical amendment that's proposed to Section 11(1)(b) of the Planning and Development Act 2018. Section 11 1A requires the planning authority to give notice of its intention to review its existing development plan not later than 4 years after it is made, and to prepare a new development plan for its area. Section 11.1 AA and AB allow for alternate notification period for Cork City and County Councils, whereby they may extend the notification period to review their existing development plan from 4 years to a maximum of 5 years by way of ministerial order. This is to facilitate the significant workload and range of complex issues arising from the revisions to the local government arrangements in Cork. However, the special provisions of the Cork City and Cork County Councils were not included in sections 11.1b for the purposes of enabling the incorporation of the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy into the development plan. For legal certainty, this technical amendment inserts the special provisions for Cork at paragraphs AA and AB at section 11.1b, 1, 2 and 3. And this ensures consistency in section 11.1a and section 11.1b provisions.
Comments from the Minister?
Which bit? That's it.
Any comments? No. Can I thank the Minister and his officials, and in particular can I thank the officials for the briefing early on in the meeting as well, who always give us fantastic information. So this meeting is now adjourned. Sine die.